Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and this time around, let's talk about why you may need to shoot at a lower ISO if you're planning to crop. The thing is, most people really don't take cropping into account when they decide what the highest ISO values are that they're willing to tolerate from their camera. Sure, at the pixel level, the noise is the same whether you crop or not. However, the size of your subject in the viewfinder and the amount of fine detail on that subject are critical considerations when deciding on a maximum ISO value. After all, when you're closer to a given subject, the size of the fine detail is relatively large on the sensor compared to when you're farther back, and that makes sense, right? As we move farther back, the size of the subject detail on the sensor gets smaller and smaller. If there's not a lot of noise, this is not a problem, and it can still yield a perfectly usable image. However, as the light goes down, our signal-to-noise ratio gets worse, and of course, we're also cranking up the ISO. Eventually, if the noise gets bad enough, it overwhelms the detail in the image. The point at which this happens, and you can think of it as when the size of the noise matches or exceeds the size of the fine detail in the photo, that's when the image becomes unusable. So the larger the detail areas, the more noise it takes to overwhelm and destroy the detail in the image. Conversely, the smaller the detail is on the sensor, the easier it is for it to become overwhelmed by noise. To demonstrate this, I chose some feathers from a local duck who was good enough to donate them to our cause. Since feather and fur detail are always a consideration for a wildlife photographer, I thought it made a good choice for our demonstration. Also, I would have used the actual duck, but you know what? They tend to be very uncooperative when you need to take dozens of controlled photos. So I taped a couple of feathers to my focus target and shot a series of images with my D850 from ISO 400 to 12,800 while filling the frame with my duck-sized test target. Then I moved back by 1.5 times the distance so the test target only filled the DX area of the image, and then I shot that same ISO series. Only the distance was changed. Everything else remained the same. So let's take a detailed look at those results now. Okay, I've imported the test images into Lightroom and they're all ready to be examined. First though, a couple of quick notes. Obviously, the image on the left is the frame-filling version and the image on the right is the more distant shot. I also want to mention that these are both using the entire imaging sensor and weigh in at 46 megapixel each. However, the target area on the more distant shot is only covering what amounts to the DX area of the sensor, which is about 20 megapixel. On the other hand, the frame-filling version of the shot is using nearly the entire 46 megapixel imaging area. This is going to result in a noticeable difference in the resolution of the feather, and it works just like that in the field. If you had two similar subjects, one that was close, one that was far away, you'd see the same type of thing. Okay, so let's start by zooming into our ISO 400 image. We're going to zoom in at 2:1 so we can get a nice good look at this feather and the feather detail associated with it. Now, I do want to remind you that what we're looking for here, though, is the noise overwhelming the detail. Obviously, we're going to have more and larger detail in the image that's closer. There's no question about that. We can make larger prints from it and things of that nature. However, what we're really looking for is when noise overwhelms the detail in each version of the image. So let's keep that in mind as we're looking through these. And as you can see at ISO 400, we have no noise overwhelming any image detail whatsoever. So let's move to 800. Now at ISO 800, things are once again looking really good. Really nice detail here. And of course, we're still keeping really nice detail over here. Noises, again, not overwhelming the detail at ISO 800 from either distance. Now we're at ISO 1600, and I do want to show you something here. Obviously, we're still doing pretty good on the one that's filling the frame. You can see a lot of detail there, no problems there whatsoever. Now, this is still looking good. We still have decent detail, especially in this area over here. However, we are starting to see that very first hint of noise overwhelming detail if you look on the left-hand side here. And in fact, I'm going to toggle this back and forth between the 1600 and the ISO 800 version so you can kind of compare the levels of noise here. And you can see we're losing just a little bit of detail when we go from 800 to 1600. The noise is eating up some of the detail in this image here, and of course it's not really eating any noticeable detail over here at 1600 on our frame filling image. So you're starting to see where the differences are here. Let's go to 3200. Now at 3200, you can see that the really fine detail is really starting to get overwhelmed by noise in this particular shot at this distance. And if we look over here, even the larger areas of detail are starting to succumb a little bit to that noise. And incidentally, 3200 is generally where I would cap out if I was using a D850 in crop mode, or if I was cropping to like the DX area of a D850, or even using something like a DX camera like a D500 or a D7500. So this makes complete sense. Now, if we look at the other side here, the closer image where we filled the frame, you can see we're still retaining pretty good detail. We might be losing some really minor stuff or starting to lose some really, really minor stuff, but for the most part, there's plenty of detail there. So noise is definitely not overwhelming any significant detail on the frame filling shot. Let's look at 64. Now at 6400, you can see we're pretty much done over here on the right hand side. All the detail is pretty much destroyed on this side. The noise has completely overwhelmed it, and it's really starting to overwhelm this area here too. To me, this is unusable. I would not use this particular image. Now on this side, we're getting a little bit on that borderline area here. We still have some pretty good detail here, and we have most of our detail over here yet. In fact, if we look at the ISO 6400 and look how the noise is overwhelming the detail here versus the 3200 on here, I'm going to switch to that one. Look at the ISO 3200 and look how the noise is overwhelming the detail here at 3200 compared to the way it is at 6400. We actually are retaining more detail at 6400 than we are at 3200 when we're at a farther distance. So pretty interesting right there. In my experience, I can go about a stop and a half more ISO if I'm filling the frame. Let's go to 12,800 for some fun. And at 12,800, we're getting solidly into lost cause territory, as you can see. This one is completely lost, and this one here is really starting to lose some serious detail here. Neither one of these would be acceptable for me, but it is interesting to see how we can still see some detail here that has not been overwhelmed by noise just yet, whereas everything over here has been pretty much decimated by noise. Of course, that was just a very simple explanation of one aspect of ISO. For more information, check out my ebook, Secrets to Exposure and Metering for Nikon. In that book, I cover dozens of topics like this in detail. This video is basically like 1/10 of 1% of what's in that book. At any rate, what's the bottom line here? You guessed it, the more you have to crop, the lower your ISO should be in order to retain good detail. Now, how do you know how far to drop your max ISO? Well, just consider how much you're going to have to crop. If it's by a factor of 1.5, like we did just now, figure you'll need to drop your maximum ISO anywhere from 1 to 1.5 stops. If it's an even deeper crop than that, figure about 2 stops. Obviously, this isn't a perfect science in the real world, but at least if you notice you're going to need to crop, you can check your ISO and see if it's too high. To give you an example, I max out at ISO 6400 on my D850, so if I can see I'm going to need to crop to maybe about that like DX area in the frame, I'll keep my ISO at 3200, preferably less. Of course, I don't even think about this if I'm at something really low already, like ISO 400 or 800 or something. In short, if I know I have a photo destined for the crop tool, I just lower my ISO as much as possible. Also, keep in mind that this doesn't apply if your main subject is small in the frame, but you're using the entire imaging area, like an environmental portrait, for instance. Sure, the detail on the subject may be low, but for shots like that, the level of detail is appropriate, so it works. Also, I realize that many viewers will consider this like a full frame versus crop type of video, and it's really not. These principles apply relative to any sensor size. The more you crop, the more you should drop that maximum ISO. The big difference between full frame and crop cameras in this regard is that you generally start with a lower maximum ISO to begin with on a crop camera. For example, I try to keep my D500 maxed out at 3200 instead of the 6400 I use on my D850. So I'd have to change that max to 1600 or even 1000 ISO on my D500 if I knew I was going to crop heavily. Again, if you want more info on not just ISO, but all aspects of exposure and metering, check out my ebook, Secrets to Exposure and Metering for Nikon. We're talking 670 pages full of game-changing info. This is info that like 90% of the photographers don't even consider when they're choosing their ISO, shutter speeds, f-stops, metering patterns, and so forth. Check it out for the price of a lunch date. It'll change your photography. Of course, remember to sign up for my free email newsletter so you never miss a video, podcast, blog post, or workshop opportunity. And I'd love it if you'd share this video. It really helps the channel. Finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that little bell for a notification when I post a new video. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.